Is everything all right, Amy?
Yeah, all good. I think we can kick off.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon all, and welcome to our panel session on Tech for Our Planet, leveraging clean tech on the road to net zero. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we're really happy to be running this session as part of London Climate Action Week. We have some absolutely brilliant panelists I'm really excited to talk to today. So first of all, we have Dr. Emily Shuckburgh, who's Director of Cambridge Zero, which is the University of Cambridge's major climate change initiative. And Emily is also a friend of COP, and she has penguins behind her because she has been to Antarctica and the Arctic on a number of occasions as a part of her job. And we'll leave that for a separate session. And we have Charles Ogilvie, who's the Director of Strategy for COP26. And before he went to the COP unit, he was in BEIS, so understands the government machine in this area very well. And we also have Christian Hernandez, who's founding partner of 2150, a venture capital fund that invests specifically in tech companies that create a more sustainable future. And before that, he's held new product roles at Facebook and Google. So he knows a lot about supporting startups and helping them move forward. So I'm really, really excited to have them all here. Thank you for joining us. We are going to take questions at the end for the second half. So please participants do start putting your questions in the chat. And we'll come to them in the second half of the session. So what we're here to discuss today is how clean tech solutions can help tackle climate issues. So, we were discussing before you guys joined about how clean tech solutions they're a part of. There is no silver bullet, and clean tech is a part of what we need in a sustainable ecosystem to help us to get to net zero, which is, government has made strong commitments to do so, and we need to make sure we actually meet those. We at Public, we've recently launched a new challenge programme, Tech for Our Planet, which we're delivering in partnership with the Cabinet Office. And although we're in the early stages, it's already demonstrated lots and lots of technological solutions. So things that can help us act more sustainably in our homes, apps to help you track your water consumption, social networks for food sharing and carpooling, things that can enable green investment and things like that. The possibilities are endless, and we think there's a real opportunity in the UK to take advantage of that. But before we kick off, as we kick off, I want to take a step back to the basics. And Emily, perhaps I can come to you for what, in your view, what is clean tech and what are the key sectors that it can serve?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as we were saying, as you said, it covers a huge range of different things. So, right from the research side of things, where there's things going on in the university at Cambridge around, on the energy side of things, around battery technologies, hydrogen, for example, lots of potential really step change advances in some of the technologies there. Transport side of things, it's about looking at new ways of mobility, and some of that might involve innovations in terms of the technology. And one of the things that we've got research going on is looking at zero carbon flight, for example, but it might be about looking at business models around how do you do mobility differently. If you look at the built environment, lots and lots of opportunities there, either in terms of construction, so looking at new construction materials. Cement and steel are very big emitters of greenhouse gases, but can we either look at how we produce cement and steel differently, or look at natural construction materials? If we look at agriculture, again, huge opportunities for clean tech opportunities there, more sustainable agriculture, precision farming and so forth. Or indeed, if we look at how we might be able to actually draw down and remove carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, either by technological means or by natural means, huge opportunities there. And then the final stage of all of this, it's not just about technology, it's also about our behavior. And so where are the clean tech opportunities for helping us to live our lives in cleaner ways, and what are either the innovations, technological innovations that can help support that, or again, what are the sort of business models that can help us create those cleaner lifestyles?
Yeah, and just another list of some really, really amazing things that clean tech can solve. So Charles, thinking about that then, and breaking down more into exactly what the government is trying to achieve, what do you think that, what goals could be most supported by clean tech? What of your ambitions can we most support with this sector?
That's a really good question. I think Emily's pointed to the kind of near universality of the challenge that we're facing. We know we have to take the globe, we have to take our country on the most unprecedented economic transformation journey over the next decade and the decades to follow that if we're going to get ourselves into a pathway to a 1.5 degree world. And that's going to impact every part of the economy. So clean tech doesn't just become, you might imagine, novel generation technologies in the energy sector, or even behavior change apps. This is, I used to run an LED lighting retrofit company. LED is a clean tech. People, in every part of the economy are embracing new technologies to make them more efficient and to cut their carbon in order to help deliver on these big overarching targets. So I think that the government is looking at this as a whole ecosystem where we have to make sure that the right innovation is happening in the lab and in the VC world, and that there is access to finance for those companies who want to rapidly scale. And I'm sure we'll come back to talk more about some of the challenges that clean tech has in sort of getting off the lab bench, but also the fact that we have a net zero legislation and there are clear long-term goals give investors and innovators confidence across the whole of the UK economy to be making those investments and driving that innovation. And you could argue, where are the great triumphs so far in clean tech? Well, we've created whole new sectors in offshore wind and solar photovoltaics. Most of that, in fact, driven by production subsidy mechanisms, not by innovation policy at all. And yet, huge amount of innovation happening, creating technologies and expertise that the UK is exporting, creating green jobs, and helping to solve the problem of climate change.
I want to just pick up on something you were saying there about investment and use that as a hook to bring Christian in. So your fund, Christian, invests purely in companies that promise to create a more sustainable future. So thinking about what Charles is saying, I've got kind of two questions on that. Do you feel confident that this is an area that investors should be looking at and startups should be looking to play in? And have you seen a rise in these startups?
Yeah, so the biased answer, given that I fired myself from my own generalist fund to go launch a sustainable technologies fund, is yes, I have a strong belief that this is not only morally needed, but actually it's going to be a way to make significant amount of money. I'm a pure capitalist, right? I'm in this for the money, but I think along the way we'll have material impact on the world. But what's really been amazing is seeing the amount of entrepreneurs beginning to focus on this, especially repeat entrepreneurs, people who already sold their fashion e-commerce business or their SaaS business, whose second go at it, third go at it is focused on climate tech and sustainability technologies. And I'm seeing more and more of those across Europe. And that's, I think, the encouraging part. They know how to build companies. They know how to commercialize technologies. They're now picking technologies that will have an impact. And that's how we become mission aligned with them.
Thank you. So building on what you're all saying, it's very clear that we have this kind of pool of innovative companies. And Charles, as you're saying, we have, the legislation that creates an imperative and a security for these companies. But we don't necessarily have a clean tech ecosystem, as it were. It's kind of, as you were saying at the beginning, Emily, there's lots and lots of different places where this happens. There's lots of different kind of types of clean tech. So what do you think the most barriers to the development and adoption of clean tech solutions? Emily, do you want to start off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few kind of ingredients that need to be in place, some of which we've already been discussing. I mean, clearly the right sort of investment is clearly important, and making sure that you've not only got the underpinning public investment, but that's also crowding in the important private finance as well. I think there's a critical role for, in the sort of broader sense, looking at other policy levers, whether that's standards or procurement or public procurement or etc. There's a whole suite of kind of things that one can think about trying to help support that. But I think that perhaps the two things that are really central to this are, one is creating the structures that allow much greater collaboration amongst different groups. So collaboration between research that's happening in universities, together with the sort of startup and enterprise sector and the big corporates that, you know, each have different different roles within this. What we've got to try and do is try and create a system whereby you're getting really accelerated R&D and then deployment and scale up. And it's only by creating the structures that allow that collaboration that you're going to do that. And I think the other thing that's really important is creating the right culture. You know, this is a really exciting opportunity, but this is a sort of behavioral thing, right? We need to get everyone really excited about this opportunity and funneled in that direction, in the same way that, you know, there've been previous waves of that sort of level of excitement, you know, .com kind of era and so forth. If we can capture that and try and funnel that, then I think we're going to sort of start to get the acceleration of clean tech in the way that's needed.
Christian, I'm sure you want to come in here.
Yeah, well, I think to that last point, I think we're seeing it already, and it's completely shifted in the last 18 months, right? When I started trying to think about building a fund focused on this, I was really scared to use the word impact because I thought people would see it as philanthropy, where now some of the leading VCs in the world, some of them are coming out of retirement literally to launch clean tech funds. So that's really encouraging. And I think it's because there's this buzz around it, there's these technologies, there's proof that they work commercially. On the ecosystem, the way I break it down is first you need kind of the tech or the science, right? And that means grants and PhDs and labs like Emily's that are actually working on the fundamental science. Then you need either those PhDs feeling they want to be entrepreneurs and schools like Entrepreneur First that help them take that leap, or experienced entrepreneurs who help them commercialize it. And this happens all the time in biotech, where the scientist is a scientist and then you bring in the commercial guys to help figure out how to take it to market. I think we need those roles to commercialize climate tech. Then the funding, both public and private, and that's there at the early stages, maybe family offices, angels, seed funds. It's there at the late stage with like every single private equity fund now having an ESG fund, climate tech SPACs. It's still a bit of a gap in like the in-between phase because climate tech, A, has a legacy history where a lot of people got burnt, and B, looks a bit like deep tech, where it takes a while longer to commercialize it. It takes a while longer to take it from the lab to the field. And so the more risk-taking investment at that kind of phase from lab to commercialization before a Temasek shows up and gives you $100 million. And then finally, market demand. And that's both the government as a driver of market demand through regulation and procurement, but also enterprise that are incentivized to adopt it. Interestingly, in a high percentage of the companies that we're looking at, their leading clients are tech companies, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles, who A, have made commitments publicly and to their employees that they're going to focus on this, B, are building data centers like it's going out of style, and C, realize that this is actually an important way in which they can lead. So we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of investment. So Amazon has a $2 billion climate pledge fund, Microsoft has a $1 billion climate fund. They're investing and they're adopting, and they can deploy at a scale that few other enterprises around the world could. So the pieces are beginning to come together.
Thank you, Christian. Charles, I want to bring you in here to kind of bring that government perspective. You touched on some of it at the beginning, and we've got from Emily and Christian some really concrete ideas of things that industry and the research community can be doing. But with your government hat on, thinking about, you know, what you're looking at to COP, the ambition that government has, what more can government be doing?
That's a great question, Syma. And just coming to the ecosystem point to start off with, I think there's a bit of a mistake perhaps in considering kind of clean tech, climate tech to be an ecosystem. You know, this is, as we've said before, a cross-economy challenge, and we have some very mature and very effective innovative ecosystems in existing sectors, and Christian mentioned biotech, but you may think of the aerospace sector, for example, as well, and various other really proven engines of innovation in this country, which are absolutely part of the climate solution, whether it's biotech producing feed for cattle that doesn't produce as much methane, or, you know, the next generation of low carbon or zero carbon air travel. So we have to sort of not make the mistake of thinking that there's a sort of blob over here called clean tech that needs to be kind of created from scratch. A lot of the innovation that we will need for net zero will happen and be driven by existing industry sectors and existing bits of the infrastructure. And I think we have to ask ourselves as government, how do we make sure that the existing partnerships we have with those sectors help steer them and encourage their focus on some of these questions around carbon abatement. There's clearly a role for government to be involved at the research stage and the funding stage, and it's been true for some time that climate impacts is one of the things that the big research funding bodies look at in considering both primary research but also innovation. I think a lot of the universities have done a fantastic job in incubating and creating a culture, as Christian said, where there's a good relationship between entrepreneurs, investors, and people working on solutions. And I think you need to build on that and help focus that towards specific climate priorities, rather than necessarily, as I said, kind of creating de novo a new sort of clean tech ecosystem. We need some money that is focused on specific gaps, and I think government does have a role, because unlike other tech challenges, arguably, where everybody wants flatter screen TVs or faster cars, not perhaps they don't. This has this is a bounded problem, right? We have to find solutions for some of these big challenges that have a pretty hard backstop on them. Otherwise, we aren't going to be able to decarbonize that sector in time to keep the world within 1.5 degrees. So I think, unlike some other innovation challenges which have a kind of specific open-endedness to it, things can just keep getting better. The government has to say, hang on a minute, look, everything's going pretty well over here and well over here, but we know that we've got a couple of really sticky challenges in how we're going to deal with these 2 or 3 particular problems. And we need to focus our kind of firepower, both in terms of what we're funding and how we're developing solutions. And I think, coming back to an earlier point that was made, some of that will be, we've got this £1 billion net zero investment portfolio that we're putting into developing some of these solutions. A lot of it is about providing the market side demand, and whether that's through the regulation of businesses, as Emily said, whether that's actually really making sure that some of these net zero commitments that businesses are making mean something, because it's a nice idea to think that half the economy is covered by net zero targets. If these guys aren't reflecting that in their purchasing in the next 5 years, that's no good for Christian if he's invested in a company that wants to sell products and services to that big corporate. So we have to make sure that there is real integrity to the corporate buyers. We have to use government procurement, and of course, where appropriate, we need to provide direct support to sectors that need to transition quickly. So it is a big ecosystem. It's not a new ecosystem, but it's one that government needs to get involved in, where there are kind of key pinch points. And perhaps the final thing to mention on that is around the sharing of data sets. I think there is a huge amount of value for data-led business, data-led innovation. Government can speed a lot of that up by creating really high quality data sets and encouraging, as Emily said, collaboration, the sharing of data sets, so we can kind of collectively solve some of these problems a lot faster than it would take if this kind of marched along at the kind of usual pace of progress.
Yeah, I mean, can I maybe just jump in as well? Because I mean, I totally support the thing just said about data sets. That's clearly going to be critical. But the other thing that I think is really important is to, in a sense, we've got to create this pipeline that goes from university and other research places where there's the kind of lab bench stuff that needs funding in itself, and then making sure that every step along the way from that into the deployment stage is funded, but it works in a way that there aren't gaps at any point. And that pipeline has got to be working for churning out clean tech products over the course of the next 4 decades or something. And there are some things that are going to be that pretty much are ready for being scaled up now today, and there are some things that are still very much at the lab bench stage, and all parts of that need to be working at an accelerated pace, and so targeting where we can best place the investment to help that happen is critically important. And I think in some instances that's going to require new ways of thinking about how to do this kind of investment.
Thank you for that. Christian, did you have anything you wanted to come in on that point?
No, I was thinking about the way we think about climate policy, right? And I think Charles kind of alluded to it. Like, climate policy cannot exist in a vacuum. Climate policy is energy policy, it's industrial policy, it's procurement policy, and it's foreign policy. And so it has to permeate through a government plan, and that then drives market demand or market interactions, and also funding. I mean, the largest constructor in the UK is the government. Like, I think something like 40% of concrete that gets poured ends up being some form of government project. And so how do we put sustainability at the core of that. I did the quick math the other day on HS2, right? So 100 billion plus infrastructure project. 6.7 million tons of cement will be consumed. That's government numbers. 700,000 tons of steel will be consumed. And if you do the quick CO2 equivalent math, that's like 9.5 million tons of CO2 will be emitted by that one project. So you know you need HS2, but you also know you can add 9 million more tons. How can you mandate that sustainable technologies that might be sitting in Cambridge labs today get deployed in year 5, 6, and 7 of a 15-year project? And I think that's where government and funders and labs need to work together.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's, you know, all of you have come at this from a different perspective, but there's been a kind of joint desire to, you know, make sure that this ecosystem, this network, this sharing happens. And I think, as you're saying, Christian, one of the important things is where government spends its money. So how can government make sure that their own procurement practices, their own purchasing choices, not only here, but everywhere, make sure that these new solutions that are on Emily's lab bench are actually making sure that they are being used, rather than just the same solutions that aren't necessarily providing us with the innovation that we need. We've got loads of questions coming in. So before we go to turn to audience questions, Charles, I wanted to ask you about COP, because one of the things that we've been talking about here, the big theme is coming out, is collaboration, and actually how, you know, there needs to be a lot of working together. And I know that's something that you guys in the COP unit, when you're thinking about the negotiation and when you're thinking about the conference itself, are focusing on. So is there anything specific that you're looking for? Like, what are your highlights? What do you think that we can get out of COP that is going to make a difference in this space?
That's a great question. And as you probably know, collaboration is one of the 4 goals that the COP president set out for the COP to deliver. It sounds slightly abstract on the page, but I mean, it refers effectively to the fact that this is a collective problem and requires a collective solution, both in terms of developing the Paris rulebook through the negotiations to make sure that we're all kind of marking our own homework in the Paris Agreement to make progress internationally. But also, almost as you cascade down through the political economy, the power of good collaborative working to accelerate the transition is enormous. And for example, we have an Energy Transitions Council, which is a group of ministers from countries who have shared challenges in terms of moving out of coal. The discussions there are both about the kind of real economic and technical challenges of that transition, but through taking a kind of collaborative approach, you know, innovation can be shared rapidly, knowledge can be shared rapidly, and you can build confidence in policymakers to make difficult, often, you know, challenging political decisions to move faster on some of these key areas. In terms of technology specifically, obviously we'll have to wait to the conference to see exactly what we land, but Mission Innovation, which was launched in Paris, has been a hugely successful initiative, aiming to both increase the amount that governments are spending on research in key areas, but also to encourage collaboration between scientists and innovators internationally, focusing on some key problems. And we're looking to kind of iterate that approach at COP26 through a number of different channels, focused on some pretty specific sectoral outcomes. And actually, if you work backwards from some of the big sectoral challenges, you know, looking at cement, looking at steel, you can sort of say, unless we reach, you know, X technological breakthrough, and that might be the cost of a ton of green hydrogen, or that might be the point at which, you know, a zero carbon concrete solution becomes cost equivalent with a conventional concrete solution, we won't be able to really deliver on our commitments. So we're looking to create a good deal more granularity in the focus of some of this collaboration around innovation in specific sectors as well, and hopefully create a space at the COPs going forward where people can reflect and kind of on the progress made against those specific sectoral innovation challenges.
Can I make a comment about so the challenge that I have with that is that for cement, for example, which is a problem that we've been focused on, like price parity on cement is not going to happen anytime soon. Like these additives being scaled out across Lafarge factories and Cemex factories, it's going to take a while. I mean, there's a fantastic company in the US that actually uses bacteria to make calcium carbonate. So the bacteria literally makes a brick. Super cool science, but you need a lot of bacteria to make a building. So we bet on a company that, you know, mitigates some CO2 in concrete today and have a roadmap to get to 70% over the next couple of years. They won the X Prize recently, but they can be deployed now. They're actually the most deployed carbon capture and use technology in the world. They're live in 400 concrete factories. And our bet is was 30% CO2 abatement times 400 is much better than 100% abatement, but only one factory in the northeast of the US, only covering the Boston area. And it's combining those technologies that can be deployed today while we invest and bet on those technologies that'll be ready for market in 5 to 6 years' time. And it's having the portfolio across both and deploying across both.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is a huge challenge when, as I say, we do have a kind of endpoint where we've got to get to a solution. And we know that, technologies get cheaper through scale. And in many sectors, you have this challenge of, are you actually going to invest in scaling an interim step? Or do you kind of hold your fingers crossed and try and make the leap to the final answer? And clearly in a sector like cement, where there is this ongoing emissions, ongoing concrete pouring, and it's such a driver of development and economic growth, we need to think very seriously about what that stepping stones look like. And as you've also pointed out, there's such a diversity of solutions. The problem is you can spend a lot of money innovating in one of those stepping stone technologies to find that 10 years later, someone's got to the next stepping stone, and all of that innovation and investment has been, great for the planet, but probably not fantastic for those people making long-term bets on the returns from those businesses. So this is again why I think government has to play a role in mediating some of these innovation pathways, because the long-term requirements of the investor community and the specific pathway to a net zero planet don't always align as neatly as in some other innovation challenges, where effectively, your investors and your outcomes are always, heavily aligned in terms of returns.
And I think this idea of this pipeline is so important, and it's all the way down to including the kind of skills and making sure people have the skills to be coming in at the bottom of the pipeline for the so that we're training people up so that they're going to be the innovators that take us through the the 2030s and 2040s, creating the new technologies that are going to be needed to get us through the rest of the century.
Yes, I think it's also, we know that the technologies that we're going to need they're just exactly like you said, they don't exist yet. So we need to make sure that we're continuously developing. Talking of pipeline, before we move to questions, I wanted to just mention the Together for Our Planet programme, because all four of us are involved in it in some way, as a partner or a friend or a member of the steering group. And I think it's a really good example of government and industry working together on creating that pipeline and solving these problems. So we've had over 200 applicants across our 6 challenges. Over 50% of them aren't UK based. So this is it is a global solution, and they'll be coming your way soon, Charles, and it's really, really excited about it. But are there other sorts of programs like that you can think of, either in the UK or, Charles, you mentioned the NZIP portfolio, but in terms of these kind of concrete programs that encourage innovation and encourage government and industry working together, is there more of that you can think of, or more of that you think we need?
Yeah, as I said, this nurturing of these innovative ecosystems has been part of government policy for some years, and I think a lot of the machinery that's already in place, whether it's the strategic bits of the research funding councils, or looking at, for example, the industrial strategy challenge funds, which looked at specific sectoral challenges around transition and transformation, often working very closely with the relevant research council to make sure that we were deploying those industrial strategy challenge funds into sectors so that they could start that process of kind of piloting and real economy delivery of some of those innovative technologies. So I think a lot of those link ups work within the kind of existing BEIS government innovation infrastructure. It's clear though that the nature of this challenge means that there's always more that we can be doing.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, Emily or Christian, before we move to questions?
Well, I mean, I think one other thing that we might say, I mean, as you said, 50% of the applicants that you've had for the competition have been coming from outside the UK. So I think the other dimension on this, in terms of kind of collaboration, that we ought to be really looking to see how we can facilitate is that kind of international collaboration. Probably especially out into perhaps markets that we don't, we've got less experience and less tradition of collaborating with, because sometimes it's by bringing together non-traditional partners that's where you really unlock the potential, either on this sort of innovation itself or in terms of the deployment and scale up of that innovation.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I think it's also the size of the companies that are innovating as well makes a difference, because what we need to be doing is encouraging the startups as well as the scale ups and the bigger companies. I am going to go over to questions because there's quite a few. Emily, I know we have a very hard stop at 3 o'clock. I think this first one, Christian, is for you. Do you see the growth of clean tech being linked to the resurgence of hardware tech? And if yes, do you think VC funding will start financing more risky early stage startups?
So the general VC doesn't like two things. Stays away generally from two things: scientific risk and hardware. And both things are critically necessary in this space. So I think that it's hard to have a generalist fund unless you have a very large scale that does clean tech on the side. As an example, one of the world's best funds called USV out of New York actually carved out a separate fund for climate tech. And so they can take different types of risks with that fund from a traditional software fund. In my case, I knew I needed to create a new standalone structure. And to tackle these problems, I have to accept that I will, especially when we focus on the build world, you will have to back physical assets. What I think the big difference is there's now a lot of other investors alongside VCs that do asset financing for some of these projects to scale. It's not asset financing to do large solar, well, they have them too, but it's large solar farms, but asset financing to build out 100,000 things that can be rolled out across cities, construction sites, mines that have incremental impact times 100,000. And I think you need that financier alongside equity financiers like VCs and grants and others to make it happen. And then finally, I think there's also the growing momentum around liquidity. We can now see that there's a path to exits for some of these companies. SPACs are playing a role in that to actually then make returns that you can then reinvest into new companies. So yeah, like I said at the beginning, massive change in the last 2 years around this whole VC focused on clean tech.
Thank you. And then linked to that is a question from Sophia George, which Emily, I'd like to come to you first on this before we come to you, Christian. So the question is, how can a clean tech startup differentiate itself from its competitors? Emily, I'd be really keen to get your thoughts on that one. And then Christian, on what key attributes do you look for in a startup when looking to invest?
Oh gosh, how can a clean tech startup differentiate itself from its competitors? I mean, that's a super difficult question to answer, in part because of exactly the fact that we've been saying it's such a wide landscape that I think it's challenging to answer. I mean, I think one thing that we've emphasized a few times here is the importance of collaboration, and perhaps in part one way of differentiating from others is by creating that network of collaborations that will enable that kind of the sort of the wider impact of that startup. So that might be one suggestion.
Yeah, I think the general answer from any VC would be team. First of all, do they have the commercial and the scientific brains to pull it off, and the delusion to believe that they can? The tech itself, and can it scale? Effectively, can you actually go global? Because for this, we actually need global deployments, not just all of the UK being net zero. The market, and this is an interesting one in climate tech, because we've seen a number of companies that are amazing science, amazing teams, but it only becomes commercially viable if carbon gets priced at $100 a ton. And unfortunately, I can't underwrite that risk, right? Because I don't know when carbon is going to get priced at $100 a ton on a liquid, commercial, obligatory, not voluntary basis. And then for us, finally, impact. If this thing scales, how can I measure the actual impact that specific company had? So, quick example: we've been looking at this company in the Midwest in the US. I'll say it openly, the most unsexy tech in the world, but it actually has a massive impact on making buildings energy efficient. And for us, it's the proof that technology, that founder, and that market, which is nascent, can at scale have like almost gigaton levels impact. And we will prioritize that level of impact over the sexiness any day.
That is a lesson for life, I think. A question, comment from Christian Perino and Charles. I think this one is well, it links to something you were saying, Christian. It would be limiting to think that the same capitalistic system that led us down the path of climate change, social and financial inequality, loss of biodiversity, etc., will be the system to fund the solutions. Feels self-perpetuating. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that, Christian. The comment continues. I like Charles's point on creating collective equity around data. What about government-led investment in collective equity across the entire tech spectrum, so data, software, hardware, to enable innovators of any background to build solutions? Charles, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, without going down the kind of philosophical rabbit hole of capitalism, I fear we've got one system now that we're going to have to use to solve the problem, because changing the system is unfortunately going to take too long, and climate change will be upon us long before the revolution ends. So we've kind of got to make the system that we have work. I think, government has a really key role to play, and of course, it should be there filling the gaps in this problem that the market and investors can't solve, which I think comes back to the conversation we were having earlier about, where do sectors need to deliver against timelines that perhaps they wouldn't get to without government's help, and again, and to collaboration and what can we do. And I think, sharing data sets is an important part of that, but you've always got to try to balance between, sharing data sets in a way that allows for the greatest amount of additional innovation without taking value out of the market for people who are providing ultimately the investment that will make this succeed. Sadly, and we wish that it were not true, the scale of this problem would dwarf any public balance sheet to solve. So we need the capital and the investment that's tied up with private investors and institutions in order to solve this problem. If we kind of completely undermine IP along the way, we're going to actually end up shooting ourselves in the foot on finding a solution. So look, it's a really good question. I think government does try and balance the sort of desire of the market for outcomes against the desire of society for equitable and obviously climate secure outcomes. But you're constantly treading an equilibrium, and when you go outside of the UK to tackling this question internationally, it becomes even more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Christian, I wonder if where you might want to bring in the point about the climate-specific ARPA. And Charles, the UK has an ARIA, which is designed to fund big, exciting innovation projects. And Christian, earlier on, you were talking about this new project in America. And I think, Charles, the point you're making is we need to make sure we leverage private capital as well. So, Christian, is there something in that about the climate ARPA?
No, it's an organization that recently launched called Actuate in the US. It's run by the former head of DARPA in the US. And it's a non-for-profit, so it'll be privately funded, focused on big, hairy goals. And one of the focus areas is around climate. It's an interesting model, right? How do you take the DARPA methodology and with private funds go tackle some of this by partnering with labs like Emily's and others? I just found out about it last week through a podcast. I thought it was fascinating. Quick point on the data piece, because Charles didn't bring it up. So there's a really interesting initiative by the government called the UK Business Climate Hub, where any company could go on, any SME can go on and effectively for free get their carbon footprint. So unless we start with a baseline as to where each business stands, we don't know how to lower or individual impact as companies, right? And this offering allows companies to go in, do some quick inputs, and get at least a baseline of where your business and your supply chain stands, and then eventually start identifying actions they can take. But once you get like millions of small businesses sharing that data, that becomes a super valuable data set, because now you can start truly looking at the baseline across the economy, not just large sectors or concrete and cement like we talked about before. So I think there's going to be some interesting marketplace around this data and best practices around this data that can be shared across industry. And then finally, on the capitalistic part, I do think there's a bit of a difference in this space where, listen, all of Europe being net zero, all of the UK being net zero means we're still screwed, right? So for this to get solved, we need technologies that can be price efficiently deployed in Vietnam and Nigeria and Sao Paulo. But the role that we as Europe and the role that we as the UK can play is that we can be the first or early adopters and accelerate that price cost curve so that these technologies do become affordable for all these emerging markets. And if you look back to concrete and steel, where concrete and steel is going to get most use in the next several decades, it ain't London, it's Dar es Salaam, and it's Saigon, and it's Bolivia. And we need to make sure that we can deploy those sustainable technologies in those markets in a price affordable way through capitalistic means, because there's no way they're going to afford 100% more expensive cement just because COP26 told them to.
Can I come in on the data point? Because I think so I think that, you know, quite a lot of the solutions around here this are going to be involving AI and data science and so forth, and for which, you know, absolutely having publicly available and accessible, so it's not just, you know, easily findable data, and data of which there is a clear provenance and some sort of quality control certification around that data as well, is going to be absolutely essential to allow those businesses to develop and those innovations to develop. And so I think there probably is a role, whilst taking into account the comments that Charles was making around, we don't want to kind of close down opportunities that, you know, for IP and so forth around development of certain data. But I think there is a real need to identify which data do we want to ensure is publicly available, and how are we going to put in place the infrastructure regulations and so forth to ensure that that happens, so that we've got a platform on which innovation can happen.
Absolutely right, thank you. Just sticking on this kind of funding and role of government point, a question about the funding grants. So most of them have very short project delivery timescales, which are unsuitable for early stage startups, i.e. 6 to 7 months from funding grants to demonstration. And Charles, you've touched on this already, so I think it'll be a good point to bring that back round, is how do we get government to support multi-year projects? And most funding awards are paid quarterly in arrears plus 30 days, meaning up to a 4-month cash flow gap. So how can government accelerate these grant payments to cover upfront capital costs? But I think on that first question, particularly about multi-year projects, I'm sure there's something that you all want to pitch in with.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, you know, we have an ecosystem, we have a set of policies that were, you know, developed for a certain set of challenges. And I think, you know, probably an ideology that the government should be sort of sprinkling key interventions into this kind of technology curve, and you know, investors in the real economy should be the ones who are bearing, you know, a significant burden in terms of commercializing technologies, because, you know, pre the climate crisis and the need to develop tech specifically against a solution, you know, the government wasn't really into picking winners. It was very much of a view that you help things get through difficult, if there was a really interesting idea, or, you know, there was some real potential in something, you would help move it forward. But ultimately, the investor community would have to kind of believe in it and see this kind of see the future for that product or service. Clearly, as I said, we're in a different world now where we have to deliver some tangible, concrete outcomes. Some of that will be, you know, entirely in-house through development agency type models, but we, you know, need to keep tinkering and improving the ecosystem, the tools and services we provide to that innovation ecosystem. And I'm sure that those comments, both on the timing of payments but also on the longevity of funding, will have got back to my colleagues in the innovation team, and I'll certainly make sure that they take them on board after this discussion.
Thanks, Charles. And sticking on this kind of government ambition and roles of government, and Christian, you might want to come in on this one as well. We're moving on a little bit to carbon offsets now. How does the UK realise Rishi Sunak's ambition of positioning the UK and the City of London as the leading global market for high quality voluntary carbon offsets? And Christian, this one, you might want to come in on this one.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Charles, but I think we already are part of the most liquid and visible carbon offset market, ETS, right? And Singapore just announced that they're going to launch one as well, with Standard Chartered, interestingly, as their sponsor. Listen, this is going to be a commodity that gets traded. So whether it's London, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Singapore that actually takes the lead on this, there's enough money coming into it, but at the same time, pretty bad quality of offsets that people are offering. I bought an acre of rainforest in the Amazon, I think, So the traceability, the accounting that goes along with it. What was it? 400 billion worth of green bonds were issued last year with literally no accounting underneath it. So at some point, when people are writing that size checks, you will want to have accountability underneath it. And I think that would be the really interesting angle. The high quality piece of that statement is the more valuable piece. How do you make these offsets, the ones that are traded in London, be of significantly higher quality and therefore command a significantly higher premium?
Absolutely. Charles, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. The key part of that is the high quality. I mean, I did some sort of day trading of carbon credits back in 2007, and the London is a place where you've always been able to buy carbon offsets, and I don't know exactly what the stats are, but I suspect it's probably got one of the biggest turnovers in terms of people buying and selling this stuff of any financial centre. So this isn't about can you buy an offset? And there's a long list of offsets out there, many of which, as Christian has said, are a fairly nugatory value to the climate, and are indeed a fairly nugatory value to those buying them, other than to have claimed that they've bought some. And the fact that they trade at the prices that they do really tells you all you need to know about the impact that they're having on the planet. So I think that the opportunity here for the UK that the Chancellor is getting at is around quality. And actually, as corporates do move into a space where their commitments they're making are increasingly under scrutiny, and they want to act within regulation, but also they want to act to fulfill their commitments with a high integrity. They will be looking for high integrity credits, and what the City of London is very good at is not just the creation of a marketplace with high liquidity, but all of the assurance that sits around it, all of the the technology that allows technology and expertise that allows companies to buy what they need at high quality with high levels of integrity and market integrity. And I think that's what we need. That's what the Chancellor's talking about as we develop this offset market, and it mainstreams with all the big aviation companies having to buy very large volumes of these going forward, for example. And I would point to the work of the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, which is a UK government join with NGOs and business to really set some standards for those credits, because ultimately you end up with a spectrum, and at one end you have very, very high quality credits, and the other end you have almost nugatory value credits, and somewhere between those is a really high liquidity high impact marketplace. But it all starts with quality, and I think that's the sort of ambition coming out from the Treasury at the moment.
And if there's this pipeline, right? So right back to my lab bench, where we're out in the fields in the fens, for example, looking at peatland restoration projects, doing research involving new sensor network technologies to try to understand what the most effective nature-based solutions, for example, are, then how to develop the metrics that are associated with judging whether or not those are effective, then working with other players out in terms of creating innovative products that are taking that scientific data and turning them into financial instruments that they can then feed precisely the markets that Christian and Charles are talking about. And so it's getting all those bits in place and getting ensuring that the investment is happening to allow each of those different components to be happening together and in concert.
It's definitely a pipeline and collaboration theme coming out here, which is a good thing. Christian, just building on that then, do you have a sense of what the carbon sequestration or mitigation potential is for some of the companies that you're investing in?
Yeah, so we do that as part of due diligence, where we forward forecast, if this gets deployed at scale, what is the measurable impact? So carbon cure technologies is an example. The concrete, the one that sucks, injects CO2 into concrete, their whole company is aligned around 500 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2030. And they measure KPIs against that every week. So that's easy. The one that we announced today called Nodes and Links is AI to deliver sustainable infrastructure projects on time and on budget. That one's a bit harder because empirically, I know delivering that project, every day that it didn't get delivered would have had a negative effect. But you really need to do the math on a project by project basis. And so there we kind of have to do a bit more general forecasting around what we think the impact will be. But what we realize is that we don't know how to do that as a team that we are today. So we're actually hiring an environmental scientist into the team Emily, if anybody in your lab wants to join VC, let me know, to help us think about pathways, think about the math, and then work with the portfolio companies to help implement that tracking and reporting. And it's not an easy job to fill.
Thank you. And Emily, I'll leave you to talk to Christian offline about that one. I want to kind of go back to some of the data and carbon accounting things that we were talking about before. And Emily, I think this would be great to get your views on this one. Do you think that granular data will become a key carbon accounting framework as large corporates and governments push for more reporting transparency and sustainable activity? And what do you think the timeline will be for that transition? And Charles, that links to the point that you were making before as well.
Yeah, I mean, granular data is important, across the board here. We're actually, my own personal research at the moment is heavily focused on using AI to better understand climate-related risks. So not so much the carbon data itself, but the physical risks of climate that businesses are exposed to. And, up until now, an awful lot of the sort of climate risk information has been at a global scale in terms of global average information, but of course what a business is exposed to is extreme weather at a particular location where they're doing their operations, and then not only understanding what that extreme weather is, but what the impact on their operations is of that extreme weather. And so what we're trying to do is combine together climate projections with all sorts of other data sets in an AI machine learning framework, so we precisely get that granularity of data and information. Now that's true in terms of climate risk, but it's also true in terms of all the other dimensions of the climate issue that you might be wanting to understand from a business perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to kind of energy efficiency of buildings and things like that, because there's a few questions there about someone's calling them less fashionable solutions. And when I first started in government, however many years ago, when I was in government, one of the first jobs I ever did was energy efficiency of buildings. And it's always stayed with me how leaky our homes are and how much you need to do. But there's kind of three questions linked to this. One about how can government help to implement the less fashionable solutions now in up to 1.5 million homes in the UK? Charles, there is a question here which I'm not going to make you answer. Roughly what percentage of commercial buildings in the UK have adopted LEDs throughout their buildings? But if you know, we're all very impressed. And kind of to the point that you were making earlier on, Charles, about that sort of technology, how can we encourage deployment of that technology? So why don't we start with those ones? How can government encourage uptake of less fashionable solutions, both domestically and commercially?
And this is a really, really fantastic questions. And obviously, I spent a long time working in the energy efficiency sector, so had to deal with the realities of this running a business.
So do you know the answer to the LED question?
So interestingly, I don't think anybody does, which is in itself quite remarkable. A lot of this work goes on. There's no register of LED installations, and there are bits of the economy that are delivering climate solutions under the radar of the government. I don't think anybody would be able to give you an answer to that. You might be able to work backwards from some sales forecasts of LEDs, but we don't really know. And clearly the answer is not as many as it should be, but possibly more than you might think would be my guess on that. Having probably tried to sell more and failed to sell more LEDs than I ended up actually installing, it was really fascinating to see how organizations, particularly medium-sized businesses, struggle to make decisions around energy efficiency retrofits, even when there was a very clear business case. And we were often taking companies' proposals that had sub 18-month payback on the project, and they were still saying no. And even when we offered them a kind of fully funded solution, they would still say no. And the main barriers were cultural ones. If you're a small business and you're focused on making cat food, you don't really understand energy efficiency. You make your investment decisions and your business decisions around making more cat food, making better cat food, increasing your market share of the cat food market. You don't want to talk to some guy about putting in smart sensors and LEDs in your building. You don't have a person in your business whose job it is to have that conversation, and the board really don't have that much time to worry about talking to someone like me about a fully funded off-balance sheet service contract that retrofits all their LEDs. And then in large businesses, it's someone's job to change light bulbs. And, there are service providers and outsourced managers of all of their property portfolios. And when you actually want to work out who's the decision maker, you realize that there's a whole ecosystem of other businesses who are actively invested in that company not making those changes because they have service contracts and building management contracts, et cetera, and probably an estates manager sitting at the board level who's got a decarbonisation plan where he's installing 5,000 LEDs a year over 10 years, and he hits all his targets that he's agreed with the board. And if you want to come in and do all his LEDs in one go, then he's a bit worried he hasn't got anything to do for the next 10 years. So there's all kinds of kind of cultural reasons why these changes don't happen. And it's actually very hard for government to, because they often are specific to a given sector or kind of or horizontal, and the built environment is so incredibly granular that you can go and think you can fix this problem in one corner of the economy and actually you've not made any impact elsewhere. Very, very difficult. My instinct is that as this agenda builds momentum, as the solutions become even more cost competitive, and the sort of awareness within corporate leadership of the need for action, either through carbon pricing, kind of crudely, or through kind of regulatory interventions. And you talked about the data sets around corporates. There is a convergence now of regulation. IFRIC, the international financial, basically the guys who set the accounting rules, are working on carbon accounting in businesses. So it will be harder and harder for companies not to focus on this stuff. Ultimately, it'll be a convergence of that top-down intervention with people with innovative solutions and compelling salespeople going door to door, talking to people using business networks to try and deliver some of these solutions. On the government side, we have a heat and building strategy coming out in a few weeks' time. I can't say in my COP role I'm very close to that work, and I wouldn't want to prejudge what I'm sure are an excellent suite of policies that are about to be launched. So I can't say exactly what the approach that we'll be taking in the coming 18 months will be, but watch this space.
Thank you. We've only got 2 minutes left, and I still have 11 questions to go through, so I'm not going to go through all of those. There's some really interesting ones on the difference between rural and urban and the technologies in those spaces, and the main challenges, and autonomous and robotics and how those can help. But I think I'm gonna slightly shift around someone's questions, which is and use that as just to get a parting thought from all of you in the last few minutes. What do you think? What are the main challenges and opportunities that you're looking forward to? Having had this conversation, what are you most looking forward to, and what do you think the biggest challenges are in sort of 30 seconds each? Christian, why don't you start?
I was about to say ladies first. The challenge, I think, is that there is no single unicorn that gets out of this problem, right? So we talk about vectors of attack. There's a lot of different vectors of attack. We've chosen the built environment as our vector of attack. We think we can have the impact the fastest, but there's energy policy and transportation and food and rural cow burps, like somebody put in the chat. And we need funding, innovation, and demand for all of those. That's what keeps me up at night.
Thank you. And Emily?
Yeah, I don't know. Listen, the climate has presented the biggest innovation opportunity of our lifetimes. And that is just a hugely exciting opportunity. I think not much more that I want to say than that.
Thank you. And Charles?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, we've talked about a lot of the challenges, but we haven't dwelt on the opportunities. And this is a multi-billion-pound opportunity as we renew infrastructure across every sector of our economy, and we create innovative new technologies that also make life more convenient, improve other outcomes, air quality, etc. So, massive opportunity. And I'm very excited by Tech for Our Planet and what we see at COP26 coming through this fantastic competition that Public are running. So I'm really excited to see the entrants and the winners of that prize.
You won't have to wait long, Charles. They'll be coming your way soon. Very conscious of time. I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. We will be continuing this conversation. So we'll talk about it again at the GovTech Summit. We'll run another panel. We've got COP26 later in the year. So we can get back together again to continue this conversation and maybe answer these questions that are still coming through. For me, the things that have stood out the most, just we're all from different sectors, we're all from different parts of the economy, but there is this shared ambition and this kind of joint understanding of the need to collaborate in this space. And, you know, that is what we're doing, as Charles said, with Tech for Our Planet, and hopefully many more to come. So thank you very much all. So someone's asked a question about the recording. That will be available on the London Climate Action Week YouTube channel. So if you want to go back over the brilliant panelists' answers, please do check that out, and look forward to the next one. Thank you so much.